welcome everyone, and thanks for joining us this morning, this afternoon, or this evening, wherever you are, for a discussion on what we feel is a terribly important topic based on a new report that the International Forum for Democratic Studies has released on the topic of compromising the knowledge economy. We're going to be looking at how authoritarian powers are challenging independent intellectual inquiry and how to safeguard the integrity of critical institutions for democratic development, democratic societies. These include universities and publishers. We may get into some other areas as well. This report is authored by Glenn Tiffert, who is going to be speaking and presenting the main ideas of the report. And we're delighted that he will be joined today for this discussion by Michelle Dunn. This report, I just note before we kick things off, is part of a series we've undertaken looking at the challenges democratic systems, open societies are facing from internationally assertive authoritarian powers. The first report in this series we launched at the Munich Security Conference in February of this year that looked at authoritarian media's influence in open societies. The second report focused on what we called corrosive capital, looking at economic investments and their influence in open societies. This was authored by Martin Hala, who's based in the Czech Republic. And today we're delighted to share this report with the audience and look forward to a discussion on it. And today's, to launch the discussion, I'm just going to introduce very briefly the speakers. Glenn Tiffert, who I alluded to earlier, is a visiting fellow at Stanford University's Hoover Institution. He'll be sharing with us his views on this. It's an issue he's looked at in depth for quite some time. And he'll be followed by Michelle Dunn, who is the Director and Senior Fellow in the Middle East Program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And she's also a board member at the National Endowment for Democracy, and I'm grateful for her participation. I'd like to mention for those of you who are on Twitter, you can join this discussion by using the hashtag NED events. You can also follow the International Forum for Democratic Studies at NED Democracy. You can follow the National Endowment for Democracy at NED Democracy and the International Forum at Think Democracy. For those of you who are dialing in by phone and would like to pose a question, you can email the questions to the email address forum@ned.org. And with that, we'll have a discussion after Glenn and Michelle share their observations. I may pose some questions to them. At that point, we'll set aside some time for questions from participants in the discussion. We'll try to get to as many of those as circumstances allow. And I'd also like to indicate that participants will be muted for the duration of the webinar, but you can submit your questions to that address I mentioned earlier, which is forum@ned.org. And with that, it's my pleasure to hand things over to Glenn Tiffert. Thanks, Glenn.
Thank you, Chris. It's a pleasure to be here to address a topic that the COVID-19 pandemic has made even more urgent than before. I'm, of course, speaking about the challenges that authoritarian regimes pose to independent intellectual inquiry, not just within their own borders, but also abroad, particularly among universities and publishers in democracies. Universities and publishers are engines of the knowledge economy, champions of our freedoms of association and expression, and they supply public goods that are essential to the health of democratic societies, such as rigorous empiricism, critical points of view, and pluralistic debate. For these reasons, safeguarding their independence and freedom to seek truth are of tremendous importance. And yet in recent years, economic and technological forces have been making that tougher. Even before COVID-19 struck, budgets were tight, pressures to monetize resources were growing, administrators and faculty were bedeviled by oppressive performance metrics and rankings, and competition of every sort was intensifying. The pandemic will make all of that worse. Some of our universities and publishers may not survive it, and those that do will emerge weaker and more vulnerable than they were before. Malign actors can taste blood in the water, and our recovery planning has to take that into account. In the report that I'm introducing to you today, I document how in the years before COVID-19, colleges, universities, and publishers experienced a litany of abuses traceable to authoritarian regimes and their proxies, including censorship, fraud, violations of academic freedom and research ethics, and surveillance and intimidation of faculty and students. Authoritarian actors exemplified by the People's Republic of China, but certainly not limited to the People's Republic of China, have exploited with remarkable discipline the decentralized governance, budgetary fragility, and inadequate risk management typical of higher education and publishing in democracies, making the most of open access to our institutions while shielding their own, and inducing us by degrees to credulously compromise core values for what amounts to really crumbs, which begs some serious soul searching. What am I talking about concretely? Let me give a few examples. Now, I'm a China specialist, and those are the cases that I know best. And as far as we know, they also seem most numerous. But other regimes, such as Russia, the Gulf states, and Turkey, are pursuing similar agendas. And I'm sure Michelle will help to shed some light on those. For years, minor scandals have erupted at various international book fairs when the organizers excluded prominent dissident voices and books so as not to offend participating authoritarian governments or to derail potentially lucrative deals with publishers in them. One especially egregious example occurred at the 2004 Paris Book Fair, when the PRC persuaded the organizers not to invite the 2000 Nobel laureate in literature, whose books were banned in China though he was born there. There have been comparable examples since at the Frankfurt Book Fair and other book fairs. Today, prestigious Western academic presses accept subsidies from the PRC to publish Chinese scholarship in English language journals, which is a laudable goal, but for its legitimation and amplification of the PRC's intrusive regime of censorship. In one notorious case from last year, the PRC partner clumsily censored an entire article from one of these journals when the issue was already in production without even consulting the editors of that issue. I've shown elsewhere that the databases of Chinese publications and research many foreign academic libraries subscribe to, and which inform our understanding of China, are censored, which allows the PRC government to subtly shape our perceptions according to its designs and to globalize its preferred narratives by covertly co-opting our own China experts. What is alarming is that many of our libraries are under intense pressure to deaccession their physical collections in favor of these convenient digital resources, which means there is no analog backstop. To be clear, the PRC is projecting its censorship regime into our information space, and because there is money at stake, we are generally just rolling over. This operationalizes the concept garbage in, garbage out, and while we'd all like to think we're too smart to fall for that, people have limited time and working memory and attention spans, and as a result, the technique works to an embarrassing degree. It is a blessing that Western universities and publishers are largely self-governing. Each operates as a free agent in a lightly regulated but highly competitive space. In the United States, apart from a limited palette of constraints like restricted entities lists and export controls, each is remarkably free to seek partners in collaborative ventures where it can find them, subject to its own calculations of cost and benefit. And this entrepreneurialism is one reason why American academia and publishing is so dynamic and productive. Alas, that is also a curse and a recipe for corrupting temptation. The logic of the market incentivizes faculty to advance their individual research and careers by partnering with outside entities that can fund it, contribute skilled labor, or burden share, and impediments to that are personally felt by individual researchers. Meanwhile, academic administrators and development officers are incentivized to strike deals for joint programs, exchanges, philanthropic gifts, research ventures, and other institutional partnerships. The proverbial golf check photo op, if you please. Um, the unwritten assumption is that everyone around the negotiating table subscribes to the same fundamental values. But that no longer holds true because some of the deepest pocketed partners are authoritarian governments or their proxies, which live by different values and are not subject to familiar standards of probity or transparency. And we've not sufficiently adapted our risk management, compliance, or due diligence frameworks to this change of circumstances. Consider this. Last year, the London School of Economics considered a large gift from a solidly pro-Beijing Shanghai venture capitalist to fund a program in China studies that would have been overseen by distinguished individuals from China. Now, talk about letting the fox into the henhouse. The lure of money no doubt led to some magical thinking about how that arrangement would actually turn out, and exposure in the press helped to restore some level-headedness about it. Faculty from American universities moonlight extensively abroad. Universities have incentivized this by shifting faculty to a 9-month contract model, which encourages them to seek external funding for the summers in which they conduct much of the research by which they advance in their careers. China in particular has identified this as a golden opportunity and stepped in with generous packages for foreign-based academics that have skills that can catapult its technological and industrial ambitions forward. And bam, you have the Thousand Talents program, which invites American faculty to double dip, taking federal money for their research, while they also run shadow labs in China and recruit graduate students from those. This can violate the terms of their employment, prejudice admissions by opening backdoor channels for applicants, distort the competition for research funding, aggravate institutional inequality, and harm US national security and economic competitiveness. It's the law of unintended consequences, and no one was really connecting the dots until quite recently. Worse, authoritarian partners have been known to bankroll entire university courses and bribe the faculty who organize conferences and invite speakers, which quite literally corrupts the academic enterprise. None of these activities are consistent with the mission or self-image of our higher education and publishing sectors, and they signal not just that everything has a price, but worse, that we are selling the integrity that we profess to hold dear for a humiliatingly low one. Authoritarian governments are furthermore weaponizing enrollments, knowing that universities are dependent on tuition from foreign students. In 2017, for example, Saudi Arabia abruptly announced the withdrawal of all state-supported students from Canada, in apparent retaliation for the Canadian foreign minister's support of imprisoned Saudi women's rights activists. While it backtracked partially from that threat, the number of generously resourced Saudi students in Canada has fallen precipitously. Similarly, the PRC has punished several universities in the US and Canada for crossing its political red lines by withholding students. Authoritarian regimes are exporting surveillance and intimidation to our campuses. PRC embassies and consulates monitor the scholarly output and public engagements of faculty, including on social media, which becomes apparent when you apply for a visa or pursue relationships in China. This can have a chilling effect on speech and prompt self-censorship, lest one lose access to the country on which one has staked one's career. Diplomats and students report on activities on our campuses and in our classrooms, which also chills speech and induces self-censorship. Chinese students with non-conforming views risk not just jeopardizing their futures when they return home, but also the welfare of their families who have been visited by police and warned to remind their children that studying abroad does not put them or their loved ones beyond the reach of the Communist Party. Sadly, for all their talk of creating safe spaces, our campuses have done shockingly little to address this problem. So what should we do? Let me start by emphasizing what we shouldn't do. We shouldn't conflate race with the practices I've described. These troubling practices are common to a range of authoritarian regimes across the globe, and the local actors in democratic societies who are complicit in them or fall prey to them also profess a spectrum of identities. It is practices and empirically justified risk profiles that we should target, not individual people, and the measures we adopt should be judged on the merits. Now, racism is real and repugnant, and we must constantly be alert to it, but we also need to learn how to keep more than one idea in our heads at the same time. The national security strategy of the United States has identified the PRC and Russia as strategic competitors, and they actually do behave like ones. Universities must recognize that and adapt to this, even if it is in tension with their universalizing mission to seek and spread knowledge. The reality is that this tension hardly burdens Russia or the PRC, where we are reminded time and again that the knowledge sector is ultimately an instrumentality of the regime. The most powerful figure on campus in China is not the university president, but the party secretary. Thus, high-energy physics deserves not necessarily less, but different attention than literature, and physics students from the PRC merit different scrutiny than those from Taiwan or Canadian-born students of Chinese ethnicity. To point out the obvious, we used to treat East Germany differently than West Germany. Today, we treat students from North Korea differently than those from South Korea or those from the Korean minority in China. Nobody says those rules are racist, nor are they said to fundamentally compromise our values. Likewise, measures that distinguish between PRC nationals and those from the Chinese diaspora are not prima facie racist. And anyway, it's the absolute height of Han chauvinism to assume that all students from the PRC are of the same race. Those of Tibetan, Uyghur, Mongolian, or other minority status might disagree. Seduced by our hope that engagement with authoritarian partners would make them more like us, we never adequately prepared for the possibility that we might also become a bit more like them. And this was an oversight born of ideological hubris. We have to fix that by getting our own house in order and reinvesting in our own ecosystem of knowledge. In the report, I lay out a tiered strategy that requires shaking up business as usual. We must overcome the tendency to take a narrow transactional view and pull back to look systemically at what is at stake, in spite of the powerful incentives not to rock the boat, to hear no evil or see no evil. Protecting free intellectual inquiry requires investing in our institutions, rededicating ourselves to first principles, and engineering a resilient defense in depth. In the report, I list a number of tiered strategies in order to achieve those goals, and I'll just flag a couple of them right here, which maybe we can develop in the discussion. Number one, we need exhaustive organizational reform within our institutions. That is, raising consciousness about the nature of the authoritarian challenge and the problems that arise in dealing with authoritarian partners. One model would be to look at what the financial industry does to tackle the problem of insider threat, which involves constant training on a regular basis and regular consciousness raising. We need to do that kind of regular training. We need to increase our data collection, our reporting to improve our compliance cultures, not just having rules on conflict of interest and commitment, but actually enforcing them. Number two, we need to seize the initiative in negotiations with authoritarian partners. We need to do a much better job of vetting them. We need to do systematic thinking about goals, interests, and risks before we start talking to them concretely about prospective ventures. And we need to adopt necessary safeguards as to personnel and data, having relevant expertise from campus weigh in. Very often, area experts who understand particular countries very well are excluded from these consultations because they raise the awkward questions which nobody really wants to confront. Number three, we need to reduce our exposure to financial coercion. In the case of universities, that means diversifying sources of students and income and increasing state support. Universities naturally turn to authoritarian partners in search of support because the income that they derive from traditional state sources has been shrinking over the years. Fourth, we need to strengthen weak solidarity among scholars and institutions. We need to stem collective action problems, increase information sharing and shared learning, and develop a sense of shared mission among them, build mechanisms for collective security, and avoid a race to the bottom. And fifth, we need to develop best practices and specify those in statements of principle and also in contract. And so those are just some ideas about moving forward. A number of institutions, including Human Rights Watch, the Hague Center for Strategic Studies, and an Australian task force have contributed very detailed plans that can get a conversation started. But we're a long way from implementing these measures across the board, where the work is only just beginning. And with that, thank you very much, and I turn it over to Michelle.
Thank you so much, Glenn. That was fantastic. Michelle?
Thank you. Thank you, Chris, for inviting me to participate. And Glenn, I enjoyed reading your paper very much. I think I was invited to this discussion partly to bring the Middle East dimension of the issue out a little bit more. And what I want to do is to say a few things about the analytical points and recommendations in the paper that particularly resonate with me and that are related to the Middle East, where, you know, the big players in the Middle East are Saudi Arabia, Qatar, United Arab Emirates, and to some extent Turkey and a few others. So, Glenn, also, you don't explicitly mention think tanks as part of the knowledge economy. Rather, you focus on universities and publishing houses, but much of what you say applies to the think tank sector as well. just to say it briefly, I mean, Gulf states have offered very large-scale funding to think tanks as well as to universities in an effort to encourage certain lines of work and discourage other lines of work. Middle East governments that have less wealth to throw around, for example, Turkey and Egypt, have also offered smaller funding, but they also try in other ways to control access to their countries, and they partially punished certain researchers in order to curb academic work. Now, your report illustrates well the uncomfortable choices that research institutions in democratic countries face once they accept significant funding from authoritarian governments or their surrogates. There's pressure on scholars who stray outside the donor's preferred narrative, enlisting students to spy on each other, legal entanglements, reputational damage. One that occurred to me related to the Middle East is in the Gulf. There's the issue of American universities that have started campuses, particularly in Qatar and the UAE. And in general, those campuses operate pretty well, but they have suffered many instances, I think, of curbs on freedom of expression for faculty and of students. Just to give an example, a faculty or a graduate student working on what's considered a sensitive issue like migrant labor, might be barred from the country or otherwise punished. And of course, there's censorship as well. Now, what I thought I wanted to focus on a little bit is what we can learn from your paper about how institutions get into this situation with authoritarian donors, and to say a little bit more about how they can get out of it or how they can avoid it. Now, in terms of getting into this situation, right in your paper right at the beginning, you identified this mega issue of the marketization or the monetization of the knowledge economy. That's an enormous issue. I don't think it's one that we're equipped to tackle today, except to say that it's there, and it's the reason why these institutions are under so much pressure to come up with funding. But to look at more specific questions of how institutions get into problems with authoritarian donors, state donors, or their surrogates, you had 2 points that particularly resonated with me. One of them is because scholars, whether they are in universities, research institutions, or think tanks, are expected to be entrepreneurs and fundraisers, there's increased risk that they will seek or be receptive to funding from problematic sources. In my experience, in their haste to secure funding for specific projects, scholars often don't see or shrug off the broader implications or reputational risks to the institution of the funding that they're seeking. Glenn's paper notes that there's often inadequate supervision of such scholars, as well as sloppiness when it comes to the process around writing contracts, the terms for such grants. And these specific issues are symptoms of a broader problem, which Glenn states accurately, that the failure of institutions to prepare for the implications of affecting funding from authoritarians is, I'm quoting Glenn, a blunder born of hubris. I've seen this many times. There's this sense that, oh, we can accept this funding from, this authoritarian donor. They won't mess with us. We're a prestigious institution, or a prestigious university or think tank or whatever. And then these institutions are often really shocked to be put under specific pressures, or to find even that their donor has taken egregious actions, maybe that are not specifically against the institution, but as egregious actions that bring strong reputational risk to whoever's accepting their funding. A couple of examples that come to mind from the Middle East. The October 2018 murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi in the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, in which the Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman was implicated, and of course he had been feted in many American institutions in the years leading up to that. Or the massive campaign against intellectuals by Turkish President Erdogan following an attempted coup in 2016. So, these are situations in which institutions that have accepted funding, find themselves quickly backpedaling and figuring out, how to handle the reputational risk. Now, Glenn has some really good suggestions in the paper too about how institutions in democratic societies can either get out of this situation or avoid getting into it in the first place. And I'm going to just sum up, what resonated with me about his recommendations into 2 points. Point number 1 is to, widen the aperture, let in more light, and examine the bigger picture clearly before you accept funding from authoritarian government or a surrogate for a specific project. Don't be naive or arrogant. To quote Glenn's paper, remember that, quote, the way a foreign partner conducts itself at home is indicative of its intentions abroad. And one thing I want to mention, I'm not sure, Glenn, if it was in your paper, I didn't see it, although I could have missed it. I think boards have a particular oversight responsibility here to ask the hard questions and to insist on transparency regarding funding arrangements. The second major recommendation that resonated with me was build mechanisms for collective security, which in a way is also related to the widening the aperture question. So I think it's an excellent idea for institutions within a sector to work on developing best practices collectively, because this will strengthen their hands, I think, in bargaining with funders or in dealing with fallout from problems. And the same is true, I think, of individual scholars and institutions. Glenn says correctly in the paper that solidarity among scholars is often weak because they see themselves more as competitors than as confederates. This is true among institutions and sometimes even inside the same institution. But I think that by developing codes of conduct related to funding, that scholars too can strengthen themselves by avoiding the kind of divide and rule tactics by authoritarian funders. Just a final point. Now, it's going to be really interesting to see how the pandemic-related economic crisis reshuffles this deck. Glenn gave us sort of the dark side of this, which is that things could get worse as institutions in the knowledge economy scramble, to find funding and to survive in a difficult funding environment. And I think that's true. But I want to point out 2 other possibilities as well. One of them is that I think some of these funders are going to, some of these authoritarian funders are going to have less largesse to spread around as they deal with fallout at home. I think this is particularly going to be true for the petroleum exporters, so the Gulf states, perhaps Russia as well. I mean, I've already seen signs, for example, that some of the Gulf states are cutting back on the enormous sums they spend on lobbying because they really have to focus on problems at home. I mean, the oil exporters have an enormous problem. They were already dealing with the kind of coming sunset of the oil era and the need to adapt their economies. And now, of course, there's been a collapse in oil prices related to the pandemic and the price war and so forth. So they may have less economic power, less to spread around. And the other issue, and perhaps this is hopeful on my part, this issue of solidarity. Perhaps I think in some ways this pandemic has shown people kind of the connections among people and the need of the sort of implications of the actions of one for the welfare of all. And so I think it's worth bringing that forward in these discussions about how institutions and also individual scholars can think about thinking together so that they're using best practices in protecting themselves from dangerous funding. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Michelle. I think I'm inclined to have Glenn offer immediate responses to those critical points that were just raised, and then we can move into the discussion if you're of a mind to do so, Glenn. You have to unmute.
Yes, absolutely. I think those hopeful notes do give us something to work with. already institutions before COVID-19 struck were beginning to have conversations among themselves about how to work together and share knowledge. And those are building blocks that we can continue to develop after COVID-19. At the moment, though, naturally, their attention is focused on survival. And so in my conversations with some university leadership in particular, I'm a little disheartened in the sense that they've decided that because they're such large existential problems really on the plate right now, that the problem of authoritarian influence seems to pale by comparison. And so it's not really near the top of their agenda. And I hope that we can continue to remind them that it's something that needs to be addressed once the more immediate challenges are dealt with. And that we don't lose the moment which we seemed to have just before the pandemic struck, where there was a consciousness beginning to gel that we need to collectively deal with these problems. I think your suggestion about boards of directors and boards playing a role here is critical, and it's something I wish that I'd included in the paper. They do have a very constructive potential role to play. Campuses in the Gulf, absolutely. The global American university has raised challenges around the world, NYU in Dubai, Yale in Singapore, various campuses in China, all raise challenges with respect to the identity of American campuses abroad, the workers that are hired to actually build them in terms of labor rights, and the standards of free expression that are enjoyed within those bubble campus programs that generally exist within larger units. I'm really grateful for the points about the Middle East, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and the Gulf states that Michelle added, and I want to open it up to the broader discussion right now. Thank you for those excellent comments.
And one question that I have before we start taking questions from the audience, it relates to this idea of leadership. Both of you have indicated that at some level, leadership needs to be taken within the institutions of the most powerful countries that have the resources in the U.S. and elsewhere to think about these things in a serious way. But Glenn and Michelle, Glenn, you've talked a lot about what's been going on in the U.S. You alluded to some of the challenges that have emerged in Europe. But to the extent that the countries with greater resources don't get this right and don't start to show models that can be emulated, what would this mean for weaker countries that have an enormous amount of engagement from China and Russia and other such countries, both in the donor context and in terms of students participating in their educational systems? I'm thinking, for example, of Southeastern Europe, Central Europe, but it's also true in Latin America and elsewhere. If the stronger countries can't start to develop norms and best practices, what does this suggest for countries whose systems don't have deeper institutional roots?
Well, the challenge is even greater in those countries, and in particular, often their political systems are also not yet mature democracies, and so we have that further challenge to work with. There are a couple of dimensions here. I think first of all, it's a mistake if we assume that even within the more developed, freer democracies like Western Europe, the United States, Canada, Japan, that all institutions are the same. There's tremendous intrasectoral inequality within our higher education sector. There are the Harvards, the Yales, the Stanfords, which have very deep benches of China expertise and very large endowments, and simply can afford to say no at times that other less well-resourced institutions may not be able to. Many institutions in the United States are desperate for funding. We had, the issue of Confucius Institutes a year ago was very front and center. And on many campuses, of course, that is the Chinese language program because there are no resources to teach Chinese otherwise. Elsewhere in the world, the situation is even more challenging. And I think it's incumbent on the more developed and wealthier countries to try to set certain standards, develop best practices, and also do the deep empirical research on what is occurring in order to help our partners in other nations kind of get a jump on the learning curve and build resilience into their institutions. This is a larger, this is not just a domestic problem, but a global problem in which we need to work with like-minded nations.
And I guess what I would add to that is your point about no system being adequately equipped to deal with this is terribly important, because I think what we've seen in this context and other aspects of the authoritarian influence challenge has been that some countries will have stronger investigative journalism capacity, and it may not even be directly connected to a particular region, for example, the Middle East or Russia or China for that matter, but it digs a little bit better and it's just better equipped to take up these kinds of challenges, puts them into the public domain, and then wider society, policymakers can take that on. I think to the extent the university and academic sector in the US is facing particular challenges, our media sector and our independent journalism sector is facing extraordinary challenges, which will invariably have knock-on effects for our own ability in the US to deal with these kinds of issues. But this is replaying itself across societies all over the world. And I think in the context of the Middle East and the Gulf, Michelle, the expertise on that region is extremely uneven once you go abroad beyond the region. And I think countries' ability to kind of decipher and analyze the foreign policies and the underlying motivations of those states or their surrogates is extremely differentiated.
Yes, Chris, and one thing that's maybe a little bit different from how some of the Middle East states, particularly Saudi Arabia, but even others too, the UAE and Qatar have gotten involved here, is where kind of religion and education come together. The fostering of a certain religious points of view, discouraging other certain, religious Islamic points of view through education institutions. By the way, Turkey as well, I should have said, gets very involved in this. And there are, certainly nations in Southern Europe and in Africa, in particular, I think, where there's been a lot of vulnerability to this. And it takes a while for people to catch on and understand what is going on, what kind of ideas are being expressed or suppressed in educational institutions because of very large funding, in some cases, from Gulf states or Turkey.
Great. So why don't I turn to a question that's been posed by one of our audience members, and that is, how can civil society work to extend and even globalize a commitment to intellectual and academic freedom in multilateral and democratic institutions? Are there any such existing norms or frameworks that can be built upon? It's a good question.
I think universities already have global partnerships with peer institutions in other countries. Those linkages already exist, and so it's simply building on them and including this angle of resilience to authoritarian influence in those conversations. I've been party to a number of gatherings that involved university leadership and area specialists from around Western Europe, Asia, the democratic countries of Asia, and North America, where we've all sat in a room and compared notes. Now, these tend to be from elite institutions, but that shared learning is a place to start, and we need to sort of widen the tent and bring others in and work with our governments and partners. I mean, civil society, the key here is that civil society needs to take the lead, and we have to do it before governments begin to step in with very crude solutions that are not well adapted to the spaces and also that infringe upon what makes our academic sector and our knowledge economy special, that they are quite distinct from the government. And this is not the case in the authoritarian regimes that we're talking about. So we don't want to lose what makes us special in this. And the key then is that we have to step up and do it ourselves in partnership with our like-minded institutions and peers elsewhere.
And one of the points you've raised, Glenn, which I think is an important one, and it really stresses the urgency now of democratic societies moving with purpose, is that the trends and the activities that you described have really been underway for quite some time. So China's engagement, Russia's engagement, any number of the Gulf states' engagement in both the academic sphere, but these other spheres that are integral to democratic freedoms in democratic societies. It's been going on for decades when you think about it. And in essence, we're only now starting to focus and figure out what the approaches are that are both effective and consistent with liberal democratic norms. So I guess for my question for both of you is, how far along do you think we are now in this process? Are we still in the earliest phases of awareness raising, such that we need to grow those circles so that there's more pressure and stimulation of policymakers and leadership in these institutions themselves? Or are we farther along than that at this stage? Michelle, do you want to start?
Well, I wish I could say we were further along, but the problem is that in the Middle East, this is very much a shifting picture. Okay, so even though some of these countries, Gulf states, for example, have offered funding for years, the Gulf states and the way they operate has really changed a lot in the last few years. I would say particularly since the Arab uprisings of 2011. So states that were once considered to be kind of harmless, allies, strategic allies of the United States government, and therefore, not particularly dangerous to accept funding from, they've really changed. There was always, I remember scandals about funding from Libya under Gaddafi, and, there were scandals and concerns in the past about funding from Libya under Gaddafi, Iraq under Saddam Hussein, and so forth. States that were strategic, rivals or even enemies of the United States. But now, what we've seen is that some of these states that are strategic allies, like Saudi Arabia or the UAE or Qatar, or maybe have been doing things since the Arab Spring. Their human rights abuses, their military interventions in other countries, such as Yemen, Libya, the whole situation in Syria. These have created, horrific human rights situations. And these states have also become, in a way, much more aggressive. They're protecting their hold on power, and they're doing it by trying to, their power, to use your term, Chris, has become much sharper. The way that they are aggressively using their power to, as I said before, to put forward certain narratives and to silence others. And so, it's made it difficult, I think, for institutions who might have once thought, well, it's no problem to accept funding from ex-Gulf country, and now all of a sudden they find out that it's really different, and this country's become much more aggressive and is exerting pressure on the institutions it has funded, exerting pressure on its students within those institutions in ways that I won't say they never happened in the past. They did happen at some times in the past, but it has all become much more fraught over the last decade.
Thank you. Glenn?
I would add that I think the success is very uneven. I feel that in the last year, we've made a certain amount of breakthroughs in the science and technology sphere on campus, and that was largely driven by government policy. In particular, the funding agencies like NSF and NIH took a strong interest in the use of American campuses as sort of pantries to be raided by authoritarian regimes for technologies and expertise that they wanted to develop and steal. And so that that leverage that the funding agencies have over our universities has tended to focus the minds of university leadership in the science and technology sphere. We do not have anything comparable in the humanities or social sciences. And there the conversation really is about sharp power. It's about freedom. It's about academic independence. It's about the ability to conduct free intellectual inquiry. These are much squishier issues than export control lists and harder to legislate, write rules around. And so the conversation really is just beginning there. And the problem is that universities are deeply decentralized. And so bringing stakeholders around the table and actually figuring out how to steer a very large and disparate ship is the challenge we now face. I think there's consciousness that there is a problem. What we do about it is the next set of even more difficult questions.
And I'll use this last segment of our discussion as a segue into another question we received from the audience. Both of you have talked about what are, in essence, how incentives and disincentives are shaped in free societies by external actors who have a very specific preference. It's usually state actor that has no checks on its power. And I think, as both of you have alluded, virtually in all these cases in the Middle East, rare exceptions, and in China and Russia, domestically, these countries are more repressive and they're very active and assertive beyond their borders. So the incentives come in the form of resources and money. The question that's been posed is one I would put more in the disincentive and threat category, and it reads this way. Glenn Tiffert's report references the use of lawfare by political figures in authoritarian regimes to threaten or bring legal action against publishers as a way to pressure them not to publish books and other materials that would bring to light information or perspectives that would damage the authoritarian's image or preferences. Considering the costs of this type of action can mean for publishers, there's an enormous prospect for self-censorship or otherwise curbing examination of important issues. So the question is, are there recognized legal instruments that can be applied to protect publishers and individual writers or instructions, or how else might they respond in the face of these challenges, which I would just say can be enormously expensive, say in libel courts in London, even if the court doesn't take these cases and put them forward. So right off the bat, if someone is hit in any jurisdiction that has a more liberal interpretation of these things and puts the onus on the person who's been hit with a suit, it can cost tens of thousands of dollars simply to deal with that suit. And it's a massive instrument of censorship. So I'm just wondering, Glenn, in your work, and Michelle, what sorts of things might we be doing that we're not doing now to safeguard against this?
Well, as you rightly point out, the British legal system and countries that follow British legal precedents are particularly front and center in this set of concerns, Australia especially. The United States is lucky in a sense because we have a First Amendment that allows a much freer range of expression. There is no codified First Amendment in the British legal system. And so British common law permits a much freer range of libel actions. The United States, in some sense, is a refuge because of our First Amendment. To address this issue is simply a legislative issue. It's something that parliaments need to raise to rewrite the legal regimes within their own jurisdictions. Fortunately, the US, as I say, is a bit of a refuge in that sense because of the First Amendment.
Michelle?
You know, I just wanted to, you mentioned the words self-censorship, Chris, and that is a vast subject. It's certainly a vast subject, I think, for people working on the Middle East, and it really can go down to the individual level. And as I mentioned, one of the things that even the countries that are not funders are doing is closing off access. They're closing off access to foreign researchers, and they're going very hard against their own researchers. And I'm talking about a lot of countries in the Middle East now, where we really just see a paucity of academic work coming out, and certainly things in the humanities, as Glenn mentioned, because they can get into questions that the government considers sensitive or undesirable politically, economically, socially. And I think, you know, we may see increasingly medical and scientific research also falling into this category when it's related to the pandemic. The pandemic hasn't hit the Middle East that hard yet, with the exception of Iran, where it's hit very hard. And but it may be hit in succeeding waves, and we're already seeing signs of you know, people who are being silenced. So this whole issue of, you know, that scholars in Western institutions, I've seen it happening at academic conferences, that governments, you know, authoritarian governments will send embassy representatives to intimidate people at academic conferences. you know, to let them know that their work has been noticed by the government in question. And of course, that's very frightening, especially when the researcher is someone who's from that country, who still has family living there, or who's planning to return there, who maybe was planning to teach in an academic institution there. So there's a tremendous amount of this going on at a low level. And I often find that, you know, there's some attempt by scholars, associations, and so forth to push back against this, but there sometimes seems to be, I'm curious what Glenn thinks about this, a disconnect between those maybe associations of scholars who may be acting in some ways to try to protect their freedom of expression, and university administrations and managements who are really, you know, they're concerned about the bottom line and so forth, and they're not as receptive to these concerns.
Glenn?
One way to think about this is to think about incentive structures and what the missions of individual players are wherever they happen to sit in the food chain. For example, individual faculty members are incentivized to do certain things, essentially to maximize their research output. And so that drives them to collaborate and to seek really transactional deals that help advance those goals, because they're measured against that by their administrators. Administrators are measured by the deals they strike for new campuses or philanthropic gifts and so forth. They have a different set of incentives. And then, of course, you have governments who are thinking about the national security and economic competitive dimension of all of this. That's not the university's mission specifically, but there's a gap there in that space which authoritarian actors move in to exploit. So I think getting all of the different stakeholders together to kind of speak honestly about how their incentives are pulling them apart rather than bringing them together, I think is a key part of this conversation. Now, with respect to the professional societies, I think here you have generational divides. The people who are influential within professional societies are people who have established reputations, who tend to be senior in their own disciplines and professions. And those people have very different interests than junior faculty or people just starting in the profession whose grip on their jobs might be much more tenuous. They may not be tenured yet. They may feel acutely the risk of self-censorship. If you lose visa access to a country, your career is over. And many younger scholars feel like their older scholars, let alone their department chairs or their universities, would not have their backs in that instance, that they would simply be roadkill or sacrificed to somebody who continues to have access to the country. And that message in subtle ways gets communicated to younger scholars, and self-censorship then is one of the results.
And I think I've heard this in private conversations with China scholars, and versions of this that replay themselves in places like Russia and elsewhere, where there's just an incredible degree of sophistication in the way in which the authorities in these countries calibrate access. So in some instances, for the most, what in the view of the authorities are the most troublesome researchers or scholars, they won't even get a visa to come in at all. Others might be welcomed in, but find that their access to the archives has been limited, or the meetings they want with certain people have been pruned back. And so the message is sent, the signals can be received, and I think unless you have some more systematic, standards-based way of addressing these problems, it's almost impossible for an individual researcher to deal with these sorts of challenges, certainly if they don't have the heft or the tenure to fight back in any meaningful way. For younger scholars, it's almost really an unmanageable sort of burden that's placed on them. So let me turn to another question from the audience. It's a fundamental one, and it's this. It's what are the biggest obstacles at the moment that we haven't already touched on to getting US universities and other open societies to seize the initiative regarding these dangers to our knowledge economy? So Glenn, I don't know if you want to take that one.
Well, the obstacles are that for 30 years, they've had a particular model of doing business, and they're very invested in that, and they have bureaucratic processes which serve that model. And so redefining the model is a challenge because it means sort of rewiring the way the university works. And there are various obstacles along the way. Faculty don't want to give up the independence and the freedom they have to strike relationships. Administrators compartmentalize information. They don't always share what they know with individual faculty. Knowledge is power, even within the institution and the university. So breaking down those barriers is important. I think the funders have been crucial here to, in a sense, compelling, twisting the arms of the universities to say, hey, you know, something has to change. And there's an ongoing conversation about exactly how much. We need to kind of replicate that, as I alluded to earlier, in the space that deals with academic freedom, censorship, the humanities, social sciences, because that conversation has not yet permeated those areas. So I think the focus on science and technology is good, but it's only partial, and we need to understand that there's much more to this problem than just that. That's an obstacle in and of itself.
Michelle, do you want to add to that? Or?
Yes, let me add to that. You know, we were talking a moment ago about generations of academics and how, you know, they might face these issues in a different way and so forth. And I also think that's true among administrators and board members and so forth of institutions. And as I mentioned regarding the Middle East, the role that some of these countries play has really shifted in recent years. And sometimes I find, you know, there will be a really different understanding of the role that a given country plays and whether it's a risk to accept funding from them or not. And there could be a real rift in understanding between younger and older. Sometimes I find that older members of boards or older academics or older administrators are sort of, they're still seeing things the way they were 20 years or 30 years ago or something like that. And they're not seeing, you know, that the role of, you know, of a specific government, and this is definitely true of some of the Middle East governments, has really shifted. And that, you know, that it is much riskier now to take that funding than it would have been. And by the way, you know, I feel for some of these institutions that have put into place long, you know, work relationships that are of long-standing, whether, you know, citing campuses in the Gulf or accepting, you know, long-term funding arrangements, and then finding that the ground has sort of shifted under their feet, that this situation has changed. And then I think that sometimes the people who struck the bargain originally, you know, are still kind of wedded to it, whereas there might be younger people in the organization with a different, and I would say more updated understanding of what's going on, who want to change things. So this is, you know, this is one of the obstacles, that sometimes there's not a consistent, you know, understanding of what the risks are among the different generations of people within an institution.
I wonder
And
if I could two-finger that, Chris.
Sure, go ahead, Glenn.
Something that I wanted to say earlier. I think it's also raising consciousness among decision makers within these institutions, who are often wined and dined, and they see the best that some of these authoritarian partners have to offer. I mean, in many instances, you could describe these relationships as the kind of archetypical abusive relationship in which the partner can be wonderfully charming in some context and an absolute frightful beast in another. And the university administrators tend to see the charming side of it, whereas those who work deep in the countries tend to see that flip side. And bridging that gap is the key here, because my conversations with university leadership, very often they see a very different side of these countries than I know, than I see, because they see the best those countries have to offer. And when you lay out an empirical case, and this is what we really need to do, we need to develop solid evidentiary cases to lay out in front of these folks and say, this is what is happening and we can document it. Very often they are shell-shocked because they've never seen this before. A cell biologist or an economist may not know what the situation for Uyghurs in China is, or what the political situation in Turkey is, or in the Gulf states. They may only spend a few days a year there in a lab. And so opening their eyes is part of it.
That's a terribly important point, and I think we have to think about more creative ways to share information with those communities, because I've had a similar experience in any number of such interactions, and something we should think about a little more directly. I have a question for the two of you that's inspired by my colleague Shanti Kalathil, who's made the observation about self-censorship that its very nature makes it very hard to measure, because if you don't hear it in the first place, you don't know if it's not happening. And so I just throw out this very difficult question to the two of you of what sort of things we might be doing to at least put in better context presumed degrees of self-censorship. For example, in the case of the mainland Chinese authorities, you can look at universities to see the extent to which universities that have significant engagement with China, say through Confucius Institutes or other programs, that they take up issues relating to Taiwan or Tibet at all. And in some cases, there's nothing at all. And you can at least reverse engineer certain conclusions, at least provisionally in those cases. But I'm just wondering, in this context of, when the goal may well be to condition interlocutors, whether it's teachers, researchers, administrators, to never even take up certain subjects. And hence, we don't even have a chance to measure them because we don't see them before our eyes. What other things might we be doing on this very thorny subject to put it into clearer focus?
I think the concept here of freedom of navigation operations is useful. The application, the idea that you hold an event on Taiwan, you will hold an event on the Uyghurs, you hold an event on changes to civil society in Egypt and political repression in Egypt. On campus, in spite of whatever relationships you may have with the Egyptian government or the Chinese government, simply to remind them that you can, that you reserve the right to do that, and it's intrinsic to your identity as a university that pursues academic freedom. We need to be thinking in those strategic terms to mark out the territory regularly so that the default position does not be that there are these gaps, these empty spaces, because those tend to build on each other, and it becomes more difficult then to actually to hold any one of these events if it hasn't been done in years.
Michelle?
And as Glenn says in his paper, institutions need to foresee this, and they need to kind of say that at the outset, and by the way, we're going to continue doing X, Y, and Z, and so so the expectations are clearly defined. Look, this is a really sticky issue, and I find that within the field, within the academic field or the think tank field, it's unattractive. Scholars and institutions don't want to point the finger, at each other, at colleagues. It can become really ugly. And so, there's a lot that goes unsaid, and therefore, as Chris, as you say, and as Shanti has pointed out, then how do you quantify that? I think Glenn's suggestion is a good one. And then, I would just point out that the tests will come. The tests will come when, a funder basically asks that a certain scholar be canned, not receive tenure or not have their contract renewed or whatever. And, and that's when, that's when institutions really need to stand up. That's when, the solidarity among scholars and among institutions becomes really important. But I think we've been failing on that score more than succeeding. It's something for, really to think about.
I recall one very courageous and vocal China scholar who I know saying that this scholar was relating an experience she had with a dean at her university who had been encouraging her not to pursue a certain line of inquiry. And she said, the minute you start those sorts of discussions about where to draw the line on that kind of expression, it never ends well. And so if you don't have the foundation in place at the outset, in the way that both of you have suggested, it only ends up in a very thorny and often not so positive sort of situation. So we have time for a couple of more questions before I'll allow Michelle and Glenn to say a few concluding words. And one question we have here has to do with the significant discrepancies in awareness and capacity on these kinds of issues between different countries that are dealing with authoritarian influence. In the research sector, the academic sector, what sorts of things might we be doing to better coordinate and accelerate the response given the different capacity among countries? So Glenn, if you want to start with that.
Well, first of all, I think it's incumbent on us to really study, to talk to partners in different regions around the world and see exactly what they're seeing on the ground in their backyards. And then the key is selecting the ones that are best placed to lead the effort in particular regions of the world, be it Africa, Central Europe, the Middle East, Asia. There clearly are institutions that share values that are aligned with our values of academic freedom and free inquiry and academic independence. And so strengthening those, I mean, this is part of just the general larger civil society initiative to strengthen institutions in countries, whether it's journalism, academia, election monitoring. It comes as a package, and all of these are self-reinforcing. So I think the key then is to simply identify who is best placed in a particular region and work with them, because they will know local players best.
Michelle, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I think it starts by, starting a conversation on this. And I think that, up till now, certainly when it comes to funding from the Middle East, institutions have often been, they're protective of it, they may be embarrassed by it in some ways, and so I think getting scholars associations maybe can try to push this bottom up to some extent, yeah, I mean, this is, I'm sorry, I'm saying it over and over again, but it's just very much needed, for institutions to have an open, but it could be private, private but open conversation amongst themselves about how to better handle this and whether they can come up with some kind of, conventions or whatever that they can sign up to that would then give them more bargaining power here, where they could say, well, I'm sorry, we can't do X because we belong to this, or we've subscribed to this, set of norms. So that, but at least, regarding the Middle East, I mean, that process is it's far behind.
Yeah, and I think it does speak to the fact that countries in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia, for example, have very considerable resources, as do the Chinese authorities, and they tend to project their influence in what can often be a rather unitary way when they're dealing with their interlocutors in open societies that have dozens of different players within a university setting, which itself is one of hundreds of universities. And so if you don't have some sort of grounding in the open societies, as both Michelle and Glenn suggest, to defend and safeguard at a very basic level these values and principles, it becomes very tricky. Because I think the other thing that we've discerned over the years is that, and both of you have mentioned this during the discussion, that the authoritarian powers have become quite adept and skillful at identifying where the cleavages are and where the vulnerabilities are. And so if they see that University X is becoming a bit resistant, they may cross the street and go to University Y and offer the goods there. And unless there's some basic safeguards where the universities that are independent and open societies can say, you know what, this offer is not good for either one of us in reputational terms, in terms of our academic standards. I think what we've seen over the years in the university sector, in the media context, think tank sector, is that divide and conquer element that Michelle alluded to is an extremely fruitful one. And so I think this is something we need to pay a lot more attention to, both in the US context, but this is something we see versions of just about everywhere. And so I'm kind of amazed that the time has gone this quickly, but that is a function of the great contributions by Glenn and Michelle. And so what I'd like to do in the last few minutes we have, if they would like to say a few concluding words on any point that was that they may have missed or they want to emphasize, this would be the time to do it. So why don't we start with Michelle, if that's okay, and then we'll turn to Glenn for the final word.
Well, I want to thank you, Chris and Ned, for taking this issue up. And I want to thank Glenn for his paper, because when it comes to the Middle East, I mean, I could show you a vast sheaf of press clippings, about like individual scandals and individual cases, of, this funding from this government or this embassy, and then this happened to that person, or, but I think that, what you've done here is to show it in a more systemic way. And I really like the way Glenn's paper gets into, how the institutions in the knowledge economy function, and what is it about the way they function, about the way they're changing in these times that makes them particularly vulnerable to this kind of pressure. And I think that's, so that's where it starts. It starts, as Glenn said, it starts with knowledge, because in a lot of cases, whether the individual scholar, the individual administrator, even some of the board members of these institutions just don't have the knowledge about what these governments are up to, either inside their own countries or the kind of power that they're projecting abroad. So anyway, thanks for being a catalyst here and getting this conversation going.
Thank you, Michelle. And Glenn?
Yeah, I want to echo Michelle's remarks about thanking Ned very much for convening this event, but also the broader set of conversations to which it belongs. I think it's critical timing. Ned, you in particular, Chris, Jessica have made fabulous conceptual contributions to the conversation, and Shanti as well. And Michelle, thank you so much for great comments, and certainly for grounding it in another region of the world that I don't lack. I lack the depth that you have in that region of the world. 2 points I want to leave with, and that is really, I think we should sort of understand that authoritarian regimes are not going to change overnight, and we can't premise our systems on them changing overnight. Really, what we need to do is get our own houses in order first, and to do a lot of deep learning. And then also, and this is where COVID-19, I think, raises some challenges. After we lick our wounds, when we recover from this and come out the other side, turning our gaze outward again and working together, breaking down the barriers between institutions and, as you rightly pointed out, between countries and partners, so that we can, pluribus unum, right? Out of many one, so that we can tackle this challenge. Because the authoritarian partners will have us at a disadvantage if they can pick us off one by one and get us to see things purely in transactional terms.
Well, that's a wonderful way to wrap things up, Glenn. I endorse the pluribus unum sentiment. And I really want to thank, first of all, the NED staff, the forum staff. You alluded to them, both of you, during the discussion, who've done great work with this event, but the entire initiative that we're running. I'd like to tell everyone that to the extent you enjoyed this, you can find more content at the NED website at www.ned.org/ideas, including Glenn's fantastic report and the others in this series, and other such content relating to these issues, including our Power 3.0 podcast and Power 3.0 blog. And I'd especially like to thank the audience for their questions and joining us. And finally, our two speakers, who really did a great job in such a short amount of time to put these important and complex issues into such focus. And so for that, I'm very grateful. And we look forward to continuing these discussions. So thanks again to everyone. Thanks to you, Glenn and Michelle. And we look forward to doing these discussions again very soon. Have a good day, everybody.
Bye-bye. Thanks, Chris.
Bye-bye.